everyone. My name is Madiha Tahir. I'm a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at ASU.
Hey, and I'm Adrian Zakar. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. We are the two co-moderators or co-organizers of today's event. And we are thrilled to open this second event of our second season of Technologies of Power, in which we host a group of speakers every other week for this spring, following a successful first season in the fall. This adventure for us started 2 years ago as we were thinking critically about the technological legacies of the war on terror. Since the turn of the 21st century in Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East, warmongering and the technologies upon which it rests have led to immense destruction.
So in this second season, what we're considering are various forms of critical praxis that could be said to have emerged in response to critical concepts or diagnostics of the technologies of power we discussed last fall in our series. In our last event, which was the opening event for the spring, we discussed opacity as a form of critical praxis, and you can find a link of the full recorded event in your chat. And today we're going to discuss the past, present, and future of Afghanistan, a country that in recent years has become a powerful symbol of the conundrums, the callousness, and the devastation of the US-led war on terror, so-called war on terror. The US bombardment of Afghanistan during this war began in October 7th, 2001, with a drone bombing that was supposed to target Mullah Muhammad Umar, the leader of the Taliban. Instead, the drone hit a vehicle outside, killing several others. According to the Cost of War project at Brown University, as of last August, over 47,000 Afghan civilians have died in this war. Additionally, another 66,000 Afghan military and police have been killed, as well as 51,191 others who have been labeled as opposition fighters. In Afghanistan, as elsewhere the US has attacked, it is people in the home country, Afghans, who have really borne the incalculable costs of the American war. After a 20-year invasion, the US finally withdrew its troops on August 30th in 2001, this past August. But it remains to be seen whether the war is really over, and that is some of what we'll be discussing with our panelists here today.
So today we have 4 panelists, and please join me in welcoming them. Our first speaker today is Ali Olomi. Ali Olomi is an assistant professor of Middle East, Islamic, and Global South history at Penn State University at Abington. He studies how Muslims imagine the Islamic world at the intersection of religion, science, and empire. And he's also got great works coming out on monsters. And you can find full biographies in the chat. Our second speaker is Sanaa Alimia. Sanaa Alimia is assistant professor of political science at the Aga Khan University in the United Kingdom. Her work focuses on migration, surveillance, and urbanity. Our third speaker is Maria Hannoun. Maria Hannoun is a postdoctoral fellow at Georgetown University, where she also completed a PhD. She's a historian of modern Afghanistan and the Middle East, with a focus on how women, transnational networks, and Islamic reformism shaped the Afghan state since its formation in the early 20th century. Now, our last speaker is Bilal Sahrawi. Bilal Sahrawi is an Afghan journalist who has worked extensively with Western media, including being a BBC reporter covering Afghanistan since 2011, beginning with the US-led invasion that toppled the Taliban. Please join me in welcoming us. Thank you for joining us.
We're so happy to have you here with us. And what we're going to do today is start with some broad questions to all of you. But I want to encourage the audience to post questions in the chat, and we will get to them and ask them throughout the conversation. And I also urge our speakers today to engage each other, interject, add your thoughts, ask questions of each other so we can have a good conversation. So with that, I think, Adrian, we'll start with the first question.
Yes. In a sense, we'd like to start with a very open-ended question that might be a little challenging and playful, but we'll ask you to go with it. Is that, is the war over then? Now, what would you respond to this?
You'll have to give us direction, Adrian and Madiha, if you want anyone to go first.
So we'll start with you, Sanaa. Why don't you give us your thoughts on that question?
I thought I might put myself up to the task. Before I kind of get to that, thank you both, Madiha and Adrian, and for the department for hosting us. I'm very pleased to be here and to be participating, especially alongside Maria, Ali and Bilal as well, just wonderful speakers and people who I've been following for a while, and I'm just very privileged to be speaking alongside. And also, thank you to include me as a part of this panel, as somebody who works on Afghanistan migration and the diaspora, but also, I acknowledge my position as a non-Afghan scholar and academic who's also working on the region. And I say that not because I'm a believer firmly of being bound to identity politics after having returned to the UK and having seen the dangers of having a Home Office Minister of the Home Office who's a woman of colour, but incredibly right-wing and incredibly anti-migrant. I know that we are not necessarily always bound to identities in positive ways, but I do want to kind of give a moment of recognition in some cases where identities do matter, and thank you for allowing my presence on this panel. And also just, thanks to all of the speakers for their wonderful work, and in particular, Bilal, your journeys that you've been documenting through your journalism over the past few years, but especially since 2021 and the events of August have been incredibly impactful and meaningful. So thank you. So in terms of, it's a purposely playful question, I think, Madiha and Adrian, that you've put for us. Is the war over? Or another question, or another way to look at it is, when exactly did the war begin? And, there are probably different levels and different layers in how we would understand the conflict within Afghanistan. And a much broader level, of course, is, when we say, when did the war start or end, we of course are approaching war from a very Eurocentric perspective, almost as if there can be a start point or an end point. But for those who've lived under direct colonialism or indirect colonialism or imperial rule, of course, time and temporality takes on a whole different meaning. And the very understanding of colonialism and of imperialism is one of violence that has a much longer trajectory rather than a starting point of, 2001 or 1979. And I think that when it comes down to understanding Afghanistan, of course, at a much broader level, the over 40-year periods of conflicts and of war that we're perhaps discussing today, from the 1970s to the current moment, cannot really be understood without understanding and contextualizing this near 2 centuries of governance practices that have been informed and influenced by colonial interventions and imperial interventions in the region. So I think that's always an important and useful framing, or perhaps to start how we understand Afghanistan and the reasons for, not necessarily why war is taking place, but why has violence been possible and continued on for so long? And that's separate from saying that we're living in a colonial era where there's a straight line and there's a straight trajectory from the 18th century to the 21st century. Lots of different things have happened. There's been lots of agency amongst actors within the region and outside of the region. But it is to understand the legacies in terms of epistemologies, in terms of borders, in terms of geopolitics, and governance practices that shape the reasons as to why violence has been able to take place in Afghanistan for so long. And then, of course, a second layer to that question is, when we're thinking about the war, or if we're thinking about conflict, or if we're thinking about violence, another thing that I perhaps would also want us to think about is, for whom does this violence, who is affected by this violence? Whether we're talking about the past 20 years or the past 40 years or the past 100 years. The experience within the country within the borders, within the population is of course going to be varied along lines of ethnicity, along lines of class, and along lines of gender. And I know, Maria, you'll have works and comments on this as well. So I think that's perhaps one of the layers, the additional layer that I would add. And then perhaps we can get on to the other reasons as to, is the war over, and when did it begin in more immediate terms? If we come to another level, I would perhaps point to the failures of the massive gaps that take place in the context of the Soviet-Afghan war. But I'll perhaps pause for a moment and then just leave that as an opening historical point of view, and then hand over to somebody else just to keep the conversation going.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much. And I like how broad and sort of foundational we're beginning here. And perhaps that's a good way to perhaps transition directly to Bilal in a way, in terms of hearing your sort of perspective on this, following sort of the sort of stratified and sort of foundational answer that Sanaa just gave us.
Thank you for having me. I'm a proud student of history, so for me it will be an extremely amazing opportunity to learn from all of you. I wanted to basically start off by 2001, the time that I was basically a salesman in a five-star hotel in the Pakistani city of Peshawar, where I was a refugee. Millions of us had lost hope. The Taliban were ruling Afghanistan. No one really cared. And suddenly, the 9/11 attacks happened. And in a matter of like days, the Americans basically started launching their invasion, which was, primarily airstrikes supported by the forces of the Northern Alliance, which were the American allies of warlords and commanders with, ruthless history of all sorts of abuses before the Taliban came into power in the 90s during the Civil War time. And the Taliban war, in my view, toppled quite quickly because I covered the US-led invasion, the bombing. I started working with Abu Dhabi TV. So I saw how the Taliban back in 2001 were so confused on the back of pickup trucks. They left and their foreign allies, Al-Qaeda fighters and others were stuck, and they were killed or captured in bigger numbers. What in my view happened after the invasion was the catalog of errors. First, the heavy-handedness by the American forces and their Afghan allies, the arrest of, ordinary citizens. For example, there was the famous case of a taxi driver who was picked up and he spent time in Guantanamo Bay. And at the time we did a big BBC story, which revealed the bigger problem, that how many innocent people were captured. The airstrikes targeting rural Afghanistan, from weddings to funerals, in my view, were some of the biggest mistakes. But if you remember, at that time, Afghanistan was also hijacked by the former US President Bush when he invaded Iraq, and the attention and resources and everything went away. In my view, from the very get-go, the Americans not only tolerated corruption and the existence of questionable characters in Afghan government, but they promoted that. They said, these are our allies. We don't care if they're involved in the drug trade or if they're human rights violators. And I think the people of Afghanistan suffered as a result of that. And this war continued. There was like cycles of violence, You went to a village in southern Afghanistan and you basically killed an entire family. You turned an entire village, into the Taliban, and Taliban started gaining more and more strength. In my view, there were flashes of brilliance, like, yes, the women rights, started basically mushrooming to an extent in bigger cities, in rural, not in rural areas, in cities like Kabul. The education of girls and boys, that was a success story. However, that was also a massive failure, because if you look at any time, there are like millions of cases of corruption, ghost schools, money not being there. Afghanistan started, from scratch in 2001. So yes, some reconstruction took place in Afghanistan had the most expensive road in the world. So if you had to like asphalt or pave 1 mile of a road, it was $1 million, where the standard price anywhere would be $200,000. So this squandering of resources, this corruption, and the fact that the Americans were actively buying the permissiveness of certain Afghans with money, in my view, started to be a major issue. In the fact that Afghan elites over the last 20 years were so disconnected from the pain. They did not live inside the country. They lived in villas in Turkey, Dubai, US, and everywhere else, meant, I mean, destructive elites. We also had constructive elites. Just wanted to clarify that. Then when you talk about Afghanistan, I hope this is an appropriate analogy that I will use here. Afghanistan is more like a shrimp, and our neighbors are more like sharks. Whether they make love or they fight, we get hurt. So regional dynamics really played in. Pakistan was one example, but Iran was there, and Russians and Chinese and others were middling in for quite some time. And we see the result today that the Taliban had relationships over the years, you know, getting even lethal aid from a lot of these other countries, excluding Pakistan, which we know the role of Pakistani army and intelligence service is well documented. I think for someone like myself and my generation, we were dubbed as the 9/11 generation. We were badly being let down, first by our own government, by our own politicians, but also by our insincere allies in the West. Because when you're an Afghan, you speak to the West from a very painful past. You speak to them from the past when the former Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the Russians were defeated, they washed their hands, they left Afghanistan to the wishes of Afghan warlords, which brought on us shame and civil war, but also to the wishes of our neighbors. And in my view, the conflict in Afghanistan, took a different turn after 2014, when Afghan government kept on asking for heavy airstrikes by the Americans. And when this started happening, the Taliban, getting their training from Al-Qaeda and others, also started carrying truck bombs in the middle of major cities like Kabul, like bringing 5 tons of explosives, or the use of roadside bombs, for example. This widespread campaign of assassination that the Taliban launched, which targeted the beating heart of Afghanistan, from reporters to female judges and prosecutors to every single capable Afghan. And which is why I still believe that even though, the Taliban have taken over in August in a military takeover, thanks to a withdrawal deal between the Americans and the Taliban, it was never a peace deal. It could have been a peace deal. We could have lived with the legacy. Today, the war continues even more aggressively. The rise of Islamic State, the ongoing violence, in the country continues. However, the Taliban would like us to think that it is an island of perfection, Afghanistan, so that is not true. You also have more serious issues like the targeted killings of former members of the Afghan government, security forces, ordinary Afghans, who are in thousands, they're hiding. The Americans in the West promised them that they would be brought in here, including Canada, but that was evacuation in the 11th hour. And that, in my view, is what an epic failure looks like. I wanted to end my comments here, and I hope you will all forgive me for being so scattered, because my thoughts are still so shattered by what has happened to the country and where we are. One of my professors in the US would always tell us that Afghanistan was the graveyard of analogies. It was not the graveyard of empires. But I would also like to borrow a phrase from you. Earlier on, you spoke about intersections. I think Afghanistan has always been and will always be the intersection of empires and regional powers. There's a lot at stake. So whatever happens, will be beyond the control of Afghans or the ordinary people. And with that, I will end. I would be happy to answer any questions and come back to you again. I apologize. I was not as structured as I would have been, but I wanted to talk to you from my heart and share whatever I felt. Thank you.
Thank you, Bilal. We really appreciate this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bilal. That was a very, very rich answer. And there's a lot of strands of that I want to pick up. So first, you mentioned the question of women's rights, and Maria, I want to bring you in here. I want to sort of step back and kind of go through some of the, we won't be able to have a detailed discussion about Afghan history or histories, I should say, but I do want to sort of get through some of the main points, particularly because Afghanistan is, as we talked about earlier, not well discussed, and even things that, we tend to think we know, I think are probably much more complicated. So with that, I wanted to sort of start with this particular photograph that I will share. Are you able to see it? Is everyone able to see it? Yes, great. So this photograph, I'm sure, is well known to many people. It's a photograph that was taken, I think, in the 1970s. And it's a photograph that was, Trump's national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, actually showed Trump this photo to convince him to stay in Afghanistan. And that was in 2017. There were other things as well, but this played into one of the reasons why Trump at that time actually did not withdraw troops from Afghanistan. So I wanted to sort of think about this photograph, and also more broadly, the question of women's positionality, which has been central to colonial and post-colonial debates around the legitimacy of the nation, the legitimacy of the state. And I wanted to ask you about the period you studied. What was the role of these kinds of debates and women's equality and rights? Were they central to questions of rule and legitimacy of the Afghan ruling class? And how did that play out? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it's one that's really central to my work. And I think, the short answer, and for those of you who don't know, I studied this period in the early 20th century, sort of around Afghans' stated independence from the British Empire in 1919. And it was a period of rapid reforms, sort of top-down reforms to women, including women's education, women's rights in marriage, and sort of broad reforms coming from Kabul around women. And I guess, the sort of short answer is women's rights have really been central to these debates about modernity and progress and the legitimacy of the state, even before the period that I study, really stretching into, the 19th century during the reign of Abdurrahman Khan in the late 19th century, which is sort of periodized by historians as the start of kind of the bounded, or the sort of formation of the bounded nation of Afghanistan that we think of today when we look at a map. And, even during this period, the protection of women and sort of the way that the authority of the state was associated with women's bodies, women's rights in marriage, through legal reforms, through conversations about honor being preserved by the state, women's honor being situated under the authority of the state, were conversations that were happening publicly in the 19th century. And I always like to say, when I talk about this 19th and early 20th centuries, that, there's a discourse of women's rights, of modernity, of dress, and it was contested by various actors. Some of the more traditional ulama didn't want women to be educated in a public school setting. They wanted them to be educated in the home. Others didn't believe that the minimum marriage age should be dictated by the sort of central government. And so you have these debates about women's rights and what is legitimate and who speaks for women. And then sort of beyond this layer, you also have women and the multiplicity of women and their voices. And I mean, my simple answer is always, or my simple sort of statement is, we have as many perspectives on women as we have sources that discuss women from the 19th and early 20th centuries. And we have so many interesting and rich sources. and to talk about sort of the diversity of women's experiences, whether they were women like Soraya Tarazi, who was the wife of Amanullah Khan, daughter of reformist Mahmoud Tarazi. So she was the Queen of Afghanistan in the 1920s, who sort of pioneered women's education and was a vocal advocate for women's sort of increased rights in marriage, and was tapping into a lot of Islamic modernist discourse from around the region about women's rights and reforms. But we equally, we have sources that talk about the household labor that was making these women and their households function, like the Hazara women who had been sort of taken into the royal family in the late 19th century under the campaign of Abdurrahman Khan, this kind of violent process of internal colonization, and a whole subset of sort of domestic labor in Kabul that this made possible. And so you have these, even within one household in Kabul, a really interesting and diverse set of women's and gendered experiences. And so the reason I sort of bring this anecdote or example from my work is because I think it's, the phrase Afghan women and girls, if I never hear that phrase again, it would be wonderful. Like it's such a ubiquitous phrase, and it's sort of lost all meaning because, who are we talking about when we talk about Afghan women and girls? I say that, and I don't want to dismiss the really important attention that needs to be paid to women's education, to women's rights. Like I don't want to minimize that, but there has been this sort of ubiquity of talk about Afghan women and girls without actually attending to their voices, the diversity of women's experiences, sort of the multiplicity of gendered experiences. What about non-binary Afghans? What about Afghan men? What about relations between men and women? What about women of different ages, different regions? And all of these women who live in Afghanistan today and who live in the diaspora and who are kind of intersecting with the war and its discourses on women, their voices and their experiences and their needs all get lost when we sort of flatten into Afghan women and girls. And, I could go on and on about this, but I think that picture you showed is a great example of sort of this one singular image of Afghan women that I could make a flip book, and that would be the 1970s. And then we have the Soviet invasion, and we have the Afghan girl on the cover of National Geographic, Shahrabat Gul. And then we have, the 1990s and the Taliban in Kabul and the imagery of women that was proliferated then. We have the 2000 invasion and the blue burqa, and like these images, there's a singular image that seems to represent Afghan women in a particular period. And I'm going to connect this back to what I wanted to say in the previous question about war. And I think, as academics and academic adjacent people, we have to think about how these images and how these words and these terminologies are being used and who they're serving. So when it comes to women and girls and the phrasing around women and girls and this imagery, who is benefiting from this sort of flattening of their experiences? And at any given point, who is that serving? And I think the same thing can be said for war more broadly. Who is defining war? And in what context is war being talked about or used or understood? And I was watching the Senate hearings. I'm going a little bit off topic, so apologies in advance, but I was watching the Senate Judiciary hearing on committee hearing on drones yesterday, and you had these two narratives at the same time. Like one is the war is over, there are no more boots on the ground, mission accomplished, like withdrawal, etc. And the other is Afghanistan is a war zone. There are Islamic terrorists there who are just dying to attack the United States, and as such, there should be kind of we should be able to bomb them with impunity if it protects us. And there was a moment where Lindsey Graham really powerfully was like, who would deny that there's a war against America in Afghanistan now? And I think that we need to pay attention to these kind of invocations of war and the imagery around war. And particularly with women, we've seen over the past decades, but particularly over the past 20 years, and even around the withdrawal, how insidious the sort of collapsing of these definitions and these categories has been. That was a big arc of answers, but I'll stop and, we can talk more about this, of course.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was great. I do want to circle back to these questions of representation because I think they're very important. And I want to thank our audience for the questions. Keep them coming. We will ask them as we proceed. But right now, I just thought, just to sort of move us forward in the question of the historical context, Ali, I wanted to bring you into this conversation. One of the, this photo that we are talking about is also used as kind of an exemplar of the progressiveness of the communist era. But we know that the story is more complicated. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the communist era. What was that like, particularly for the opposition, and what kinds of, resistance did it fuel? So if we could just sort of get a sense of that moment from you, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I just want to start by echoing the thanks to Adrian, Medea at Columbia for having us, and to the wonderful panelists. It's always a pleasure to meet fellow scholars and be in conversation with them. So thank you for having me. The history question is always a tricky one because where do you start, right? Wherever you start is an intentional act, and it tells us a little bit about the story. And so when you start in 1979, that tells us something. You start in the 1990s, it tells us something. History has a beginning, and we're often told history has come to an end, but clearly it hasn't. But also the real question here is, and something that I'd like to pose as a sort of framework, is that history isn't just contextual, right? We often talk about the influence of the past on the present. But what gets lost in that conversation is the influence of the present onto the past, right? The way in which history is constructed by historians, the narrative and story that is told is very important. And this goes really clearly to Maria John's point about what was happening in the Senate committee, right? That is conflicting histories, the decision of the contemporary moment to think through the past and how that past is constructed. So I do want to kind of frame that this is an overarching kind of theme for us, is not just how does that history important today, but also how we remember that and why it's so important for us to think through some of these narratives. The Soviet Union's invasion is a complicated one, and one in which we see, again, these conflicting narratives. On one hand, we're told that the sort of beginning of the conflict is the invasion in December. In 1979, the Soviet Union invades, and that begins the sort of introduction of Afghanistan into the global arena. But the reality is that the real context begins much earlier than that. And we can certainly link it to the colonial era without claiming some sort of teleology or one linear approach to history. We can argue that Afghanistan's history is shaped by a series of colonial entanglements, the crossroads of empires, if you will, that is constantly shaping and remaking Afghanistan, both at the memory of it, but also the structures of it. The Soviet invasion being one particular example that has much deeper roots. Part of the great game, part of the game between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War was to see Afghanistan as a site of building up, a site of pouring in money in order to ostensibly build Afghanistan's infrastructure. But what that produces fundamentally is a government that is entirely reliant on foreign aid. And so what happens is you have a series of a process of endemic corruption. One person commented that the majority of the main employer of Afghanistan and like literati and elites who are graduating from college, it was the Afghan government itself. And that government is reliant on foreign aid. And so the result is that if you're a young journalist, a young military commander, a young technocrat who's just graduated from a university, you're now working for the government, if you're going to feed your children, you're probably part of that corrupt system. That's just the reality of what happens when you pour billions of dollars into a country ostensibly for infrastructure building, whether it's the Helmand Valley or the pass. But in reality, it's about shaping the ideology of Afghanistan, of trying to bring Afghanistan into either the global liberal order or into the sort of Soviet order. The result is that, yes, you can certainly see certain elements of progress happening. Women's rights, we see certain changes happening. We do see infrastructure building, but it's also a period of great anxiety, a period of conflict, and a period of outright violence. We start to see the instigation to this period in which we see images of women being liberated in Kabul and women wearing mini skirts, and the sort of open-mindedness of the Marxists is also the period in which people who disagreed with the Marxists were disappeared. And at the same time, it's the period in which other regional powers, as well as the United States, begins to agitate against the Marxist government. And so it is a site of extreme conflict. And so the peaceful images that you see in Kabul are not reflected in the experiences in the rural. It's not reflected in the villages, and it certainly isn't reflected in the liminal spaces of the border. The result of which is both great powers decide that they need a more direct response in Afghanistan. The tensions ramp up. The United States begins to agitate quite early on. So contrary to the idea that the United States gets involved as a result of the Soviet invasion, the US gets involved many, many months earlier by beginning to funnel weapons, by funneling arms, as well as money through the ISI into various insurgencies in Afghanistan, the result of which is Afghanistan becomes a battleground between international powers who see Afghanistan not as particularly economically important to them or important for them even in terms of their domestic policy, but part of this global international struggle. Afghanistan is important because it's the site where Soviet Union is involved. That's why the US cares. Afghanistan is important because it's the site in which the US is involved. That's why the Soviet Union cares. So it becomes only important as a proxy to something else, which fundamentally raises, and this kind of circles all the way back to the original question, is what do we define as war in the first place? If we define war in a conventional Eurocentric model, then the war begins when the Soviet Union invades. That's how we begin the context. But if we can start to think of war in more complicated ways, then we can acknowledge that the war didn't begin in 1979, but began years earlier. That the funneling of money into the region, that the shaping of the ideologies into the region is also an act of war. In the same way, that helps us to understand what's happening this exact moment. If we take the Eurocentric framing of war, then yes, the war is over. Why? Because Americans aren't being killed in Afghanistan. But the very last act of the United States was to drop a bomb, a drone in Kabul that killed people. That is not an act of peace. That is not an act of the end of a war. That is a continuation. But war has been shaped over the past 20 years to be beyond the sort of conventional sense through not just drone warfare, but a variety of different ways. And so here I bring in Sanaa's very important intervention of thinking through layers. The war is over in the sense that troops have left, but the war continues in economic terms. We are making, the global community in the United States are making an intentional decision to starve and freeze Afghanistan. That also is an act of war. Just yesterday, people in Abu Dhabi in the camps protested because they have been in limbo for 7+ months, not knowing what their status is. Immigration and borders are also acts of war. So when we talk about the withdrawal, it's important to talk about the withdrawal as an act of war, as a continuation of the war, not as a cessation of it. And so this is how I would bracket the Soviet era and the contemporary moment.
Thank you so much, Ali. I just have a follow-up question, which is the following. I think even in standard sort of, let's say, left narratives, there's a conflation of the Mujahideen with the Taliban, and then in the mainstream, often a conflation of the Taliban with bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. So can you tell us a little bit about the Mujahideen and sort of lead us up to the moment of the rise of the Taliban?
Yeah, there is a conflation that happens between the Taliban and the Mujahideen, and that's because all brown people look the same. I see it on Twitter all the time where they show like Mujahideen hanging out with Reagan. They're like, look, it's the Taliban. And this is a sort of ubiquitous, whether you are leftist or you're a right-winger. The reality is that Afghans become sort of a homogenous other. That's it, right? And so we need to ask ourselves, whatever our political commitments are, we need to ask ourselves how it is that we portray this history. The Mujahideen are really just a coalition of forces. Even the word Mujahideen is just a blanket term for groups that often don't have very similar ideologies, that may disagree in what their actual political aims are, but whose only thing connecting them all together is a sort of resistance movements to the state as well as the Soviet invasion. The Mujahideen start off as a coalition group, a ragtag. Some of them are more organized. We see this with the Hizb Islami, led by people like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. But we also see Maoists and Marxists who are part of the Afghan Communist Party, was a Maoist party, the youth Maoist movement, were the Mujahideen as well. This kind of, whenever I talk to my fellow leftists, they all go, what the F are you talking about? I'm like, yes, Maoists were part of the Mujahideen because there was factions within the Marxist movements. And so the Mujahideen are really just a term we use to describe this coalition of forces that sort of aligned, sort of didn't. They didn't always have the same ideology, but they emerged really as a grassroots movement of ordinary Afghans, some of whom are really organized, part of an insurgency, part of some type of militia, some of whom are just really people picking up guns and fighting for their villages and their cities and whatnot. That over time begins to organize a little bit more as we start to see more and more foreign aid flow from the United States, from Saudi Arabia, and from China. We should note, this often gets forgotten in the conversation, is that China does fund the Mujahideen. It funnels through the ISI. We start to see more and more organizing, as well as the importation of foreign soldiers. We start to see a call, sort of pan-Islamist call that's led by Abdullah Azam, who was one of this Islamist movements, really thinking transnationally and saw this idea of a defensive jihad as central to this global movement of Muslims. So we start to see the Arab Afghans, the sort of global movements, and they're not really all Arab, but they're coming from Bosnia, they're coming from North Africa. In fact, there's a really important trans-regional connection between Algeria and Afghanistan, and how there's a movement of troops back and forth because a lot of the Afghan Mujahideen end up in Algeria at one point. And so we start to see this increased mobilization. The Taliban are a faction within the Mujahideen, but are not synonymous with it. They're a product of the 90s, after the chaotic withdrawal of the Soviet Union and the internal fighting of the Mujahideen, which leads to regional warlords. The Taliban become the product of that chaos. They are the response to that chaos. They see the warlords as fundamentally corrupt and failing to bring stability. And so they introduce a sort of violent attempt at creating order. And their first kind of acts initially are really stabilizing these local villages against corrupt warlords. And it isn't until relatively later that they start to ally themselves, around the mid-90s or so, that they ally themselves with the remnants of the Afghan or the Arab Afghans, which include Al-Qaeda. And that's when we start to see the Taliban emerge as an insurgency. They eventually establish their own Islamic Emirate in the late 90s, and then they collapse with the US invasion. But it is important to see them as a product of that history, not just a continuation of the Mujahideen.
Thank you so much. I think this is so fascinating because it responds to some extent to a question we had in the chat. It's a question that keeps on coming back when we talk about Afghanistan at this graveyard of analogies, as you aptly put. The question was about, what is the responsibilities of Western powers or foreign powers, and what is the responsibility of the Afghan people? And this is where Afghanistan, I think, is a particularly conceptually very, interesting and challenging space, is that difference, that these wars are built on those binaries, men and women, outside and inside. And yet, like, the situation of Afghanistan just completely transcends all these things, right? And that's what I think collectively you've been pointing out to. And so I'd like to follow up on that, and thank you for answering our question. Like, that was sort of a question in the chat. I think what you said does answer, which is there's no point in pointing out to the domestic responsibility of Afghans or to the foreign responsibilities of foreign powers, but rather to a situation that has been groomed for so long, an elite that has been built for so long. And so it's become inseparable from Afghan politics, as far as I was able to sort of understand. And so I'd like to follow up with a question about scale. Now, we talked about foreign powers, and we talked about Afghanistan. We haven't talked really about the ethnic diversity of Afghanistan and how it plays out into this, and we'll go back to this later. What I'd like to ask you now is to sort of zoom in into the regional scale and ask sort of the elephant in the room to me is always Pakistan, right? And I'd like to maybe ask us directly that to Sanaa, because you've written a bit about this, but it will be open to everyone to answer that. But Sanaa, can you tell us a little bit more about the Durand Line, its role in the Pakistan-Afghanistan rivalry, and in general, how do we integrate in that regional scale in those understandings of the domestic politics of Afghanistan and its importance on a global scale for the past 40, 50 years?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I mean, I think the elephant in the room, of course, is, especially when we're talking about these kind of bigger wars and we're talking about the proxy war between the Soviet Union or when we're talking about the US, there's also a very clear relationship and a very clear rivalry and dynamic taking place between Afghanistan and Pakistan that is really central to understanding the politics of what takes place in Afghanistan over the past 40 years plus. And, you know, and these continued collections with colonial legacies as well. So I think it's a really, really important point. And fundamentally, much of what we know about this Durand Line, this border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, a Durand Line which was created in 1893, very much part of this 19th century process of the makings of the modern Afghan state as we know it, along with the earlier period of the Sistan border, the border alongside with Iran as well, or Persia as it was then, are fundamental to understanding the continued conflicts and continued tensions between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I think it's still there. If you look and if we understand as to why there is a tension between these two countries, if you look at the news, if you look at what's happened in the past week with, you know, recent attacks taking place, Pakistani soldiers being killed, or tensions between Afghanistan and Pakistan, the elephant in the room, of course, is the Durand Line, and that can't kind of be can't really be escaped in any way. And I think for those of us who are interested in trying to understand what's been happening in Afghanistan, one of the key important things, of course, is to bring back the agency to these states and the post-colonial elites within Afghanistan and within Pakistan, because whilst much of this broader narratives of how we understand it, especially from where many of us are situated in the moment, in North America or in the UK within Europe, it's kind of this conflict of empires and this bigger battle between empires that's taking place. But a lot of the dynamics between and the tensions between Afghanistan and a lot of the dynamics of these conflicts and of these wars, why is China able to funnel in money, for example, which it really did do so, as Ali mentions, in the Soviet-Afghan war. China is able to funnel in money to Afghanistan, to the Mujahideen via Pakistan, because Pakistan has a clear interest in the 1970s and the 1980s to try to interact and intervene in Afghanistan. And, you know, the way that the kind of the story unfolds a little bit is, of course, that for the Pakistani state that is born in 1947 after a period of partition with India when the subcontinent is divided, it is a state that is insecure and it's kind of upheld together in a piecemeal kind of fashion. Of course, the bigger rival for Pakistan is India, and that's kind of the bigger existential crisis that occupies much of its early years. But there is, of course, always this ongoing conflict with the Durand Line on the other side of the border, where there is a tense ethnic kind of configuration of the Pakistani state, where the Pakistani state is dominated by the military, where it's dominated by two main ethnic groups, the Punjab and Muhajirs, or Indian migrants or Indian refugees, and it's dominated by the military and the bureaucracy. And these other kind of ethnic groups within Pakistan are, of course, loosely held together because Aisha Jalal, the historian, tells us that Pakistan as a state, when it was formed, was effectively a moth-eaten state, and partition, or the subcontinent and the creation of Pakistan, wasn't something that was anticipated, and it wasn't something that was technically meant to happen. So Pakistan is born in a period of insecurity, and Afghanistan and the state of Afghanistan, which is dominated in terms of ethnicity, a question that we came back to that was discussed earlier, is dominated predominantly by a Pashtun ethnic grouping who's contesting this borderline. And from the 1940s until the 1970s, what you really see is, on the one hand, you have Pakistan feeling very insecure because of its own internal ethnic imbalances. You know, there is a cessation, 1971, East Pakistan, Bangladesh gains independence because of the heavy-handedness of the military, because of the violence of the military bureaucratic state. And you have, on the other hand, Afghanistan, which is increasingly becoming dominated by a Pashtun ethnic ruling elite who is using this idea of Pashtunistan. You know, the Durand line is connected to this idea of a Pashtun ethnic state. And the idea of Pashtunistan as being somewhat, you know, the other elephant in the room, if we're going to talk about the Durand line. And for the Afghan state, who is dominated by a Pashtun elite, Pashtunistan is really an important kind of, you know, the idea of there being an ethnically pure Pashtun state in Afghanistan is not something that's really what is desired by the Afghan post-colonial kind of like ruling elite, but it becomes a useful way of influencing or gaining political and geopolitical influence in the region. It's a useful way of pushing against Pakistan, and it's also a very useful way of kind of consolidating power and following kind of like, or mimicking or notions of ethnic purity and the nation state within the post-colonial imagination of Afghanistan itself. So it becomes quite a useful kind of tool and then a point of tension. And so for Pakistan, who's in this position of insecurity, when they get the opportunity to intervene through the US or through kind of being supported by allies who want to intervene in the Soviet Union, it's a key moment that is kind of taken up very much in the 1970s, in the 1980s, and continues onwards from that point. And then it's something that becomes a way of kind of gaining influence in Afghanistan, a way of kind of silencing this irredentist whispers of the ethnic tensions within Pakistan itself, right? It's a way of kind of silencing that tension. And for the Afghan state, especially the PDPA, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, in the 1970s, Ali, you mentioned kind of these, you know, the Communist Party, of course, they were still dominated by Pashtuns predominantly, right? So they are still a predominantly Pashtun elite who themselves also push this idea of this greater Pashtunistan, and who also push this idea of questioning the Durand line and still raising that big question mark over the Durand line and saying, okay, this is a way that we're going to gain influence in the region. This is a way we'll gain influence within the state. And this is why this kind of point of tension continues on. Today, of course, with the Taliban, you know, they've recently said that, again, the Durand line is not something that would be recognized by the Taliban. And it's interesting when you speak to different ethnic groups within the Afghan context. You know, I've presented and had these conversations amongst different groups, but it's also interesting to hear the response within, you know, the Pashtunistan issue or the Durand line issue can often be a point of contention and a real point of conversation for nationals of Afghanistan who may perhaps are interested, invested in this issue from the perspective of being Pashtuns themselves. If you ask this question to Hazaras, to Tajiks, to other groupings, the question might be framed in somewhat of a different point of view. So I would say, if we're kind of, you know, this is still a question that hasn't been answered. This is still fundamentally very much at the heart of the tensions between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Much of the work and what I look at the moment focuses on borders, surveillance, and security. And much of what I've been doing has been looking at how it is that refugees within Afghanistan, from Afghanistan, who are based in Pakistan, effectively become the border in a way. And much of the way, because, you know, Pakistan has been host to at least 8 million or so Afghan refugees at its peak in the 2000s. I think in 2005, the highest number of Afghan refugees in Pakistan was something like 8 million persons. Officially, the number was calculated by the end of the 1980s or 1990s as being something like 3.9 million Afghans living in Pakistan. When kind of the first survey of Afghans who were living in Pakistan was completed, the number in the 2000s would probably be coming much more accurately to being around about 8 million persons or so, 7 to 8 million persons or so. And in the 2000s, really, what's been happening is that because of this contest over the Durand Line, because of this contested border, what you see is happening within Pakistan, at least, or the side of Pakistan who's trying to position itself as the strong line, hard man, militarized state, what it's trying to do is trying to make that border much, much clearer. And there's a number of ways in which it's doing it. One of the ways in which it's been trying to do it is through what I've been working on, which is trying to control migration across this border. So prior to the 2000s, for example, in the late 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, Pakistan was quite happy to welcome Afghan nationals into Pakistan as a refugee resource, because it's kind of a way, you've got all of these refugee camps, you've got the Mujahideen who are being in these refugee camps, you can influence folks, you can use people, you can welcome them in as a way of questioning this Pashtunistan, problem, way of questioning or way of gaining influence in Afghanistan. So they say, come along, welcome in, we're going to influence the state, we're going to influence all of you. Post 2001, when you have the war on terror taking place and the dynamics somewhat shift, having an Afghan presence within the country, this so-called Islamist presence, which of course Pakistan has a huge responsibility of the Taliban in the 1990s, becomes a bit more problematic and a bit more tricky on the global stage because of how the war on terror is unfolding. So you have this position where Afghan nationals are no longer welcome. So one of the ways of making the border clearer for the Pakistani state is to kind of say, okay, migrant groups, you're no longer welcome, therefore we're going to put these restrictions or put these borders and make them much clearer. Another way is to develop a border fence, which is kind of what we see happening in the 2000s and 2010s onwards. Pakistan starts to develop a border fence. Another thing is it starts to use biometric technologies on its own populations, as well as Afghan nationals and migrant populations. And it also has this process where it's starting to try to really perform the border and say, actually, the border matters and we're going to kind of make it much stronger and much clearer. And it's also, of course, then supported by the US, right? Who kind of invest, or US and Canada and other firms invest in a lot of these infrastructures to try to make this border clearer, because this fluid border, this Durand Line, has been really important and useful, for example, for Pakistan, for the US during the Soviet-Afghan War, because that's the way that you could get the Mujahideen into Afghanistan. And this fluid border, of course, we haven't discussed, but it's related very much to the tribal areas, or the former tribal areas, which lived in this kind of state of exception, these Pashtun borderlands within the Pakistan side of things. And that border was very useful, 70s for Pakistan, late 70s, 80s, 90s, when you have an influence of the Taliban, becomes a little bit less useful in this post-war on terror era. So it becomes important to start drawing that line much, much clearer. So there are really interesting dynamics about this Durand Line question that are taking place. And it's still very much fundamental to the bigger geopolitical story between the two countries at a regional level. But I'm just going to quickly, and sorry, you'll have to forgive me as well for being a bit scattered as well, but just to quickly say that that's the one level of it, right? This idea of, we're talking big politics, we're talking geopolitics, we're talking the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan in the Durand Line. What I find really interesting, and what I have always found interesting in my own work, apart if I move away from the surveillance side of things, has been the ways in which people have moved across and do move across this border and kind of move beyond the geopolitics, right? So here, much of my own work has focused really on Tachibadis, informal housing areas, squatter settlements, where you have people who are Afghan nationals moving into Pakistan and vice versa, and the other way around as well, which is perhaps less discussed, where the border, as we understand it, and the Durand Line border as this kind of barrier and source of conflict between the two countries is actually, much more fluid and much more often a site of exchange and much more a site of acceptance between groups. So I think that's a really important story to not forget when we're talking about the regional dynamics, because the geopolitics are really interesting. And it's really great to talk about this high level politics, but there's a whole level of people's histories that are taking place that question our understandings of Pashtunistan or the Durand Line, where you have new identities being forged, new relationships being forged. You have folks who, there's, nationality matters, nationalism matters, national identity matters. But there are many people who live their lives between cities. I worked in Karachi, for example, with Afghan families who moved into the city in the late 1960s and late 1970s. And they very much have an Afghan identity and will recognize that they are from Afghanistan and there's a territorial attachment. But they also will come out with phrases and say, well, I'm of Karachi, I'm from Karachi, I'm a Karachiite, or I'm a Peshawarite, or something like this. And it will vary along experiences of age, how long one has lived in the country, if you live a transnational life. But this idea of moving a bit beyond the borders to try and understand the regional dynamics, I think, is also an interesting way of understanding what's taking place.
Right. And I think
in the people's history, right? And that's it.
No, thank you so much, Sanaa. I think we all needed your sort of expertise and clarification. And there's a fascinating exchange happening in the chat where an audience member is also showing us that Pakistan is also changing at the same time. And its own demographic makeup and its own relationship to Afghanistan has changed. I mean, you'd expect it to change from 1979 to today, right? Or even before. But we tend to forget this. So thank you so much, Sanaa. It was really enlightening.
So I actually wanted to follow up from what Sanaa was saying with you, Bilal, because you were a refugee in Pakistan, in Peshawar. And I'm wondering if you could speak about your experiences there. As an Afghan refugee, what was your relationship to, Pakistanis? What was your relationship to the state? I'm sure you have a very complicated relationship there, and I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about that.
Thank you. Aren't all relationships complicated in today's age? When we left Kabul, we were forced in the 1992, the year. The Pakistani people actually wholeheartedly welcomed us. And we were able, I remember, to live within the same communities that Pakistanis were living, so long if we could afford the rent. I remember we lived briefly in a camp, which was called the Nasr Bagh refugee camp, very popular. Diana and Benazir and others came to it. And unlike Iran, I must admit, Pakistanis have never stopped Afghans from, for example, getting education in Pakistani institutions, or Afghans working inside, Pakistan. And the people of Pakistan, I remember, at least for our family, were always part of our funerals and our weddings, not just the Pashtuns, the Punjabis and many others where we lived. And it is lifelong friendships that, today we have with those families. We've still stayed in touch with them. However, going back to the Durand Line issue, unfortunately, I come from a district from where I can see the Durand Line from my own home in Kunar in the east. It is a colonial border. What it has done, it has, deprived us of visiting our cousins or our father's cousins who are just on the other side. So to give you an example, in 2003 and 4, I remember we had a wedding which was on the Pakistan side, but everyone was fit on this side. Or for example, the hospital and school was always on the Pakistan side, but the villages were on this side. So I hope that such issues are resolved in the longer run, where I agree with Sanaa very, very much that Afghan politicians and leaders failed to bring consensus within Afghanistan, because it's also a country where we Afghans as all come from a very painful past, which was not too long ago. So it would be important to do that. However, looking at the current tensions between the Taliban and the Pakistanis on this issue of fencing and Durand Line also now makes it very clear to all of us that there was a cost to the military takeover of the Taliban, because the Taliban are suddenly saying, I don't accept the fencing. They are allowing TTP guys to launch cross-border attacks in bigger numbers. So that is where I will end, and I have no shame to say that I have a huge attachment to the issue of the Durand Line, mainly because myself and our families, we want to be sure that we can visit our relatives today who are in Pakistani Senate, who are in Pakistani, society at the highest echelons, but we're same families. And at the end of the day, borders or whatever you want to call it separated us. So let's hope that for the sake of us and many more Afghans and Pakistanis, there could be a mutually agreed, solution where at least families can meet each other and the states can agree on the wider issue of politics and borders and whatnot. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we'd like to close perhaps on this chapter of the question of scale and, the domestic, the global, and also the human, the sort of individual perspective through all this by asking perhaps a question to Maria about a historical perspective of these transnational movements and actors, including, non-hegemonic actors, if you think of it, right? So from refugees to networks of women activists in the early 20th century. So what does the historian of Afghan state formation has to say about the present moment, to put it differently?
It's interesting. I have a lot to say that I don't know. I'm still ruminating on Ali's way of thinking about the relationship between the past and the present and how we sort of use our own lenses to make sense of the past as well. And one thing that I'm thinking about a lot with these questions, especially being asked in the chat and sort of reflecting on the regional versus the global, is even sort of this connection between nations in the region and these interregional or transregional connections that seem so fixed to us today. So when we talk about how people in the Middle East or the Maghreb view Afghanistan, or what the war on terror has done in terms of yoking Iraq and Afghanistan together in this particular way, in this violent way, or how the Durand Line sort of connects or disconnects Pakistan and Afghanistan, I think sort of as a historian who focuses on movement, on mobility, on transregional connections, one thing I try to excavate, sometimes in an overly romantic way, but also as an important corrective to this, is how these borders and these regions and these fixed ways of looking at Afghanistan are actually quite novel, and they're not, they don't represent the experiences of the past and of my historical interlocutors. So, or, the people I study or read or think about. And so, one thing that I find really fascinating in my work is that people and ideas, and particularly women, were moving across the region. Soraya Tarzi, who I mentioned earlier, who was, a member of the elite, but had Arab Syrian heritage. There were at a sort of less highest echelon of society, as Sanaa was speaking about, there's a long history of trade and money lenders being Indian in Afghanistan, and sort of those mobile networks between British India at the time and Afghanistan. The teachers who were teaching in the universities and high schools and even primary schools in Afghanistan were from India, from Turkey, from Iraq in the early 20th century. Fascinating historical sources from Baghdad, from the sort of Sufi communities in Baghdad in the early 20th century, describe Afghan travelers coming through and staying. And there were these networks of trade and travel and pilgrimage, education. And so I think that, as a historian, one thing I think about a lot is just these regional flows and how Afghanistan is centered in the region, in these regions, in these crossroads of regions. And we often, in the present, use that that location and that these geopolitical tensions is a way to isolate Afghanistan and disconnect it from these regions, or say it's between these regions, when really it's a part of these regions, and sort of interconnected in so many different ways, sort of historically. And so I think, yeah, so I think when we talk about the Middle East, when we talk about how Arabs, how Muslims think about Afghanistan, I almost I want to say that even these divisions that we're sort of creating are not so accurate and sort of don't capture the complex movement and the connections between Afghanistan and the broader region. And as historians, I think that really matters in terms of who studies Afghanistan, who asks questions about Afghanistan, whether historians of Afghanistan or, historians of Syria should be thinking about and reading and sort of involved in the literature and the production of knowledge on Afghanistan as well. So yeah,
reading Al-Afghani a lot,
Yeah, exactly. Who knows where he was from? Yes, but true. I mean, he's a great example of someone who moved across these regions, and yeah, I think. I think, yeah, so I'll stop there because I know we're running out of time, but.
Thank you so much in a sense. And I think that's a great segue into the other section we'd like to address, which is about the question of representation. I know it might be hard for you who are so much immersed in this topic and this place to then look at it from the outside. So let me help you. In September, your former president went on TV and said that he had to flee the country, because he didn't want Afghanistan to become another Syria or Yemen. Now, for someone like me, that was very shocking. I never thought in my lifetime, I would hear something like that. And so I'd like to ask you about your reaction. I'm sure you realize that Afghanistan had become this quintessential symbol for violence and war, right? And now perhaps there's this idea of reference, right? Of a referent for this, and other references are being created, whether in Syria or Yemen. And so how do you deal with that representation? What is the right language to speak about such place without maybe, without perhaps reducing it to this? And perhaps just a general comment as a way to, we'll have many more questions, but as a way to open that section on representation. If you can just say a small reaction to that moment when Afghanistan no longer wanted to be another Syria.
Who is this question directed to? Just
all of you.
All of us. Okay. Plural you, y'all.
I mean, in a sense, what do you think about the fact that Afghanistan, I think, is circulating as a trope for devastation, that this is the primary mode through which the country is seen and circulates, not just in the West, but at other sites as well? And can we imagine other kinds, other modes, I think we've been speaking about these transregional networks, and some of them certainly provide an alternative worldview, but sort of just a comment on this kind of this type of circulation.
I mean, I'm going to just jump in, because I think what's really interesting is, of course, first of all, listening to the materials that are being produced by Afghans and people from Afghanistan themselves. I think the work that is being done, and I do think that this is where Bilal is right, that the past 20 years, for all of the problems of the neoliberal peace-building project in Afghanistan, the ways in which mobility within Afghanistan and within the diaspora have taken place, social mobility, and the voices and the scholarship and the activism has come through. I think, of course, if we're going to think about mainstream narratives of kind of what Laura Bush is producing and what Trump is producing, we're just going to get frustrated. But then there are works of journalists, including, of course, Bilal and others, and a whole generation, a younger generation of people, both inside Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan, that are just doing immense work within cities such as Kabul, but also within the diaspora, or folks who've had to be evacuated post-2021. And those are the really interesting voices and spaces that do much of the work of undoing these tropes and these representations. And they're really powerful voices. And I think what I've been really impressed with is the levels of scholarship that have, as well as academic and activist work, where, finally we are seeing more people who are actually vested in the region or from the region or connected to the region who are being given the space. And of course, the classic, white male panels still exist and are still there, but there are works and interventions that are being taken place against this. So I think that's a note of hope and something that has to be continued to be supported, and where there is responsibility for those of us who occupy positions of power to take a step back when needed, and also to push other people forward. And this is why it's a process of, building connections, building networks that take place within the academy, within scholarship, but also, of course, most fundamentally, importantly, outside of that space. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one thing that's very important. And then, of course, secondly, in terms of, but that's not to say that the tropes are not still incredibly powerful and don't still shape people's lives. I mean, I'm thinking about the fact that, I lived in Germany for a number of years, especially post 2015. And the tropes of Afghanistan as a space of violence or as a space of conflict were incredibly powerful and had huge impacts on kind of how migration regimes accepted or didn't accept people as legitimate refugees or not. I mean, Afghans in Europe were, for example, the second highest refugee population and continue to be after Syrians post-2015 so-called refugee crisis. Yet this trope of Afghanistan as a violent space or as, not being deserving refugees or not being legitimate, is it still an incredibly powerful one that shapes and affects people's lives, both in terms of what's directly taking place in Afghanistan itself, but also outside of it. And I think there is still a lot of work that needs to be done to kind of understand why these tropes are used and why they're useful or why they're not useful. When it comes to migration policies, it's always useful, right? Because you don't want to include people or have them in. So the question of these tropes, where they emerge from and why they continue to be used, is also something quite important, I'd say.
And just to jump onto that, I think, and Ali spoke about this, and I think it touches on a lot of what we've been speaking about. It's a very convenient as well to absolve these imperial interests. It's convenient to say that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires and that there's something fundamentally ungovernable about the Afghan people and that it's violent and that, there won't be peace there. Those tropes really absolve the US of its, war crimes and criminal sort of history over the past decades. And so I think that, we've seen it operationalized on all sides of the political spectrum in this country, because all sides are guilty of generating this really disastrous war over the past decades. And so I think that that's just it's very, very, it's very much part of the political fabric in the United States to have Afghanistan as this sort of face of a failed state or an ungovernable state.
I wanted to sort of follow up on that question. As after 9/11, the Taliban did offer to hand over Osama bin Laden, right? And this was refused by the United States. And I'm wondering, what you think about that, and if you have, what you sort of think about that moment. But also, I just wanted to read this quote to you and get your comments on it. Richard Armitage, who was then part of the State Department, had a meeting with the ISI, Pakistan's intelligence agency, security chief, I believe, Mahmoud Ahmed at the time. And Mahmoud Ahmed was explaining sort of the history of the Taliban, various kinds of relationships in Afghanistan, the Soviet occupation, etc. And Armitage basically cut him off and said, no, the history begins today. So this kind of erasure of this longer history, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about that. And secondly, the sort of flip side of that is, of course, Afghanistan is in a sense buried under an excess of specific types of histories, at least in the West, right? Specific kinds of anthropological histories, specific kinds of notions around tribal histories. And so how do you as scholars kind of find the language or find a new way of sort of approaching your subject matter? And how do you invite people into the field? So I'll just open that up to any of you if you want to take a moment. And Bilal, for you, I would love to know, similarly in the context of journalism, kind of what are the types of stories that you were not able to tell because of the kinds of ways that stories are shaped, in particularly as you were reporting for the BBC and other Western media outlets. What are stories that maybe fell by the wayside that you thought were important, but perhaps your editors or others, or you knew that these stories would not work in a Western within a Western outlet?
Thank you. If you just allow me 2 Afghan minutes, I wanted to respond to Adrian's comment earlier on.
Yes.
I think the Americans were very clearly telling Ghani, the former president, that he should adopt a strategy, one like President Bashar al-Assad, where he will be relying very heavily on the American drones and airstrikes as if that was the magic solution, and then just holding on to Kabul and the surrounding provinces. There's a very, historical picture. I say historical, where the CIA chief and the ambassador and the American general suddenly are meeting with Ghani, and you can just see in the faces of these people. August 14th was that picture was taken. And what Ghani failed to elaborate or to tell the world, just like he failed to tell his own people, that's probably what he meant. Yes, there were a lot of fighters going from Afghanistan into Syria, fighting alongside Islamic State. You're aware of the Afghans who were fighting on behalf of Iran in Syria, the proxies, poor refugees and others being told, here's what we will give you if you fight. Moving on to the journalism part, I had incredibly supportive colleagues and bosses at the BBC, where I worked for 14 years. And it was always my idea to basically tell the story that had something to do with the country's beauty and people and culture. And I started the very famous hashtag Afghanistan University, where I would basically show the natural beauty of the country. And luckily that trend succeeds until today. But one story that did actually break my heart to this day was the story of Australian soldiers committing war crimes. And I'm somehow grateful to certain Taliban officials who are now higher up of enabling me and giving me safe passage in 2017 to go to Uruzgan province. So I had to drive from Bamiyan for about like 22 hours. And meeting this family who had lost like 11 members, which was like cold blood, these guys had just killed women and children. And they drove through the roadside bombs and fighting. For a few days, they could not do it. And then they came and made it to the safer part of remote central Afghanistan. And I wonder, where are those families today? What about justice? Yes, there was a lot of work in Australia trying to basically bring those into justice, So Afghanistan, in my view, it does break your heart in multiple ways. As a country, it can get under your skin. But for me, this was the story that really broke my heart, because I went and I traveled and I spoke to them for hours, and no one really believed them at first. But once the story came out in Australia, we also realized that the problem was much bigger, much wider than what had been reported. And this is only, we're talking about war crimes committed by a group of Australian soldiers. What about the war crimes committed by forces of the former government, by Taliban, by everyone? So I feel that, and I want to be very respectful and grateful to my Western colleagues, but we are not today able to go to Afghanistan. Afghan reporters are being lashed and beaten up, while our Western colleagues are there, and some of them are writing books, which is good for them, perhaps. And in my view, the time for us is now. This is when the Afghan people need us. We should be reporting on the hunger. We should be reporting on the crises. We should be reporting on these things. And over the last 20 years, the Afghan media family has paid a very heavy price. We were gunned down, we were mysteriously killed, we were blown up by suicide attacks, you know. And yet again, everyone, including the Taliban, and this is the irony, including the international community and former governments, they were using the Afghan media as a success story, as a trophy wherever they went. The reality is that Afghan media family, some of us like who are in diaspora, you know, this can just go away. All the hard work, you know, the investments that people put onto this. On the issue of stories, you know, I was heartbroken on the 10th of August to go with one of my colleagues and interview people who were leaving the fighting in Kunduz. And this one family was telling me that only they could bring a pair of clothes. And it made me really, you know, emotional. And I started getting teary eyes because this is what had happened to me in the Civil War. And little did I know that in a week's space, this will be my fate and the fate of, you know, thousands of Afghans again. So this never-ending tragedy that has hit our own life, our own stories, you know, and quite tragically, we have never been detached from what Afghanistan had to offer in terms of, you know, the tragedies. So thank you for allowing me to make that point, and I'm sorry that I took slightly longer than I should have. Thank you.
Not at all. So yeah, please go ahead.
Can I jump in
Yes.
about the question of how we sort of have this conversation going forward? Because I think part of this is very much also shaped by disciplinary questions, right? Where does Afghanistan fit in the discipline of history and the discipline of anthropology? As all of us can sort of attest to, it's funky and weird. Where is the history of Afghanistan the history of Central Asia? Is it the histories of South Asia? Is it the histories of the Middle East? You get very adamant scholars of the Middle East. Afghanistan is not Middle Eastern history. It's not part of the Middle East, despite the CIA imagining it's certainly part of the global Middle East, part of the imperial project. Oh yeah, it's definitely the Middle East. But us academics, we must draw that border. The Middle East ends at Iran. So what does that do to this story? This goes back to the sort of flip that I did at the beginning, which is that the present shapes history, right? It's not just history shaping the present, but also the sort of considerations and questions that we will ask will also determine the stories that are going to be told going forward. It is significant for us to acknowledge, I think it's important for us to acknowledge, I should say, that these disciplinary questions are not just academic disputes. This goes back to what Trio argues, that there are no silenced people in history. There are no voiceless people in history. There are only the silenced. And where we draw our disciplinary borders, the type of questions that we ask, and even where we start our questions are going to determine which silences are in our narrative. Who is included, who is not, whose voice is heard, and whose voice is not. We are going to be entering into an era, in the same way that Armitage said, history starts now in his arrogance, so too will we hear that history starts now about the withdrawal. There will be books written about the withdrawal. We already know that Hollywood is very much planning on creating another pick where Matt Damon or they're all this Matt Damon, it's probably Timothy Chalamet, I don't know. One of these people are going to be saving Afghan interpreters, right? They're going to go in and save Afghan interpreters. But the question is, where does the story of the withdrawal start? Does it start in 2021? Or does it start earlier than that? And these are the sort of disciplinary questions that we have to ask, is where does the narrative start? We also have to ask ourselves, how do we go beyond the binaries, right? Withdrawal, war, peace, Afghanistan as a site of conflict or as a site of liberal success, Afghans as villains or victims. These type of binaries are ways that we need to look beyond. And I think Maria John really brought this up, and she hinted at this, and hopefully she'll pick this thread up, is thinking about transregional, thinking about the global, not thinking in terms of imposed borders. So histories of Afghanistan are histories of Islam. Histories of Afghanistan are histories of the transregional. histories of Afghanistan or global histories. I often say I'm a global historian. I'm a global historian of the Islamic world. I like to work in the Turco-Persian world. I will move between the Ottoman Empire to Afghanistan with absolutely no difficulty. Why? Because I see connections there. And these are ways of having really productive conversations about building these stories that go beyond the imposed disciplinary boundaries, beyond the national boundaries, and can help to really push back on the stories that are going to be shaped in the coming years.
Does anyone else want to jump in, or?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I find it really interesting that I think there's a similarity between all of us from different disciplinary perspectives where we just kind of ignore the convention, which is just ignoring the convention of the national boundaries and the borders, or whose voices one should listen to. And I think, you know, for me, this panel's been quite a safe space in a way, right? Because it's a safe space because many of us are operating within shared kind of scholarly or scholarly practices, or as practitioners are kind of engaged in shared practices, where the aim is really to kind of go beyond the trope or go beyond what we are told how we must study Afghanistan or Afghans or the borders or the regions, by kind of looking out at those voices, the Afghanistan that you don't see, that Bilal's, you know, hashtag, which has been brilliant, or kind of looking at those people who kind of question and challenge these boundaries and borders, which is perhaps why, Adrian, I got a bit flummoxed when you asked me about the Durand line, because I was like, I know it's the elephant in the room, but I always forget about it because I'm always kind of trying to look at those stories beyond, right, that are not just about the high level geopolitics, or are not just about kind of, you know, those tropes of Rambo 3, but perhaps, you know, Rambo 3, which of course puts this, you know, Soviet-Afghan war into context, and, you know, white savior in Afghanistan, and so on. But I think that it's a really interesting way of doing history or of understanding politics. That is where we can get a lot of richness from. And I think that in my own work, and I can see it here from what others are saying as well, that's a real interesting way of doing history, of trying to understand and producing knowledge that goes against the grain. And I think that's, you know, also looking at different sources. You know, I'm really interested and intrigued when we talk about politics of representation in terms of what's being produced at local levels in the Pashto vernacular, in Dari, in Urdu. The Iranian film scene of how representations of Afghans are in that scene are also incredibly rich, incredibly interesting. You know, the Landé as a form of poetry that tells a story as a different way of telling us history. These are conversations that need to be brought in and are being brought in. And it's only kind of as we kind of expand our ways of producing knowledge that we can kind of do that. So I think that's kind of, for me, really interesting. And I think, Mario, your work on women's history and that kind of, I think it's just incredibly fascinating as well in terms of what it's doing in terms of pushing the borders and boundaries of how we understand those connections of women from, you know, Cairo to Kabul is just fascinating. So.
Thank you so much. This is, I mean, I think all your comments are pointing in the same direction. It's really rare when this happens, so I'm really grateful. I just want to bring up here the thought of a military historian called Tarak Barkawi, who is in England and tells us something very interesting. I think the case of Afghanistan really brings it to the fore, which is, since the Enlightenment, at least in the West, our intellectual tools are geared towards telling stories of progress and peace, movement towards peace. But when you are studying the history of a place like Afghanistan, or I'd say Syria, we could say other places like Yemen, somehow there's a dissonance there, that you don't have the toolbox that corresponds to these places. And yet this toolbox is the ones that everybody uses, and they don't know any other. And so there's a form of dissonance here that has a potential of being violent on a thinker, I think, that in my experience. And something to deal with. So listening to you, whether it is the transnational or the border that's not a border, we are geared towards thinking of states through their borders, right? Not through their border crossings. And I think you could go on and on and on with that. And there's a more general statement here about, you know, Western philosophy since Enlightenment, and the fact that it doesn't really gives us the right tools to understand stories like that of Afghanistan. Thank you. So. Madiha, perhaps, yes.
Yeah, I'm you're right, but I'm struck, Bilal, you mentioned Uruzgan, and immediately to my mind, the February 2010 attack came to my mind, which was a NATO helicopter attack in which 33 men, women, and children were killed. And then you had also mentioned earlier the bringing trap bombs into Kabul by the Taliban. And so I'm wondering, even, internal to what is present day Afghanistan, there is a kind of a fractured geography of experience, it sounds like. And so how do you engage that fractured geography? I mean, obviously you don't want to take a quote unquote objective viewpoint, so to speak, but how does one engage the kind of very kind of almost opposing experiences in some respects, because some communities are, have predominantly been, groups have been predominantly attacked by the Taliban, other regions have been predominantly attacked by other kinds of forces. So how does one sort of engage this fractiousness now?
I mean, one of the things that I have tragically noticed is this poisonous environment on social media, both among Afghan diaspora, but also by Taliban media influencers and officials. And I call it cyber tribalism, where basically, I don't know who created the term, but that's what exactly it is. The idea that basically as soon as you express your view or you write something, you are being attacked, by a very violent mob of trolls. I think personally that Afghans need to come together and start a constructive discussion. The reality is that the Taliban have taken over power militarily. We all know that. And how can we now best try to help the people of Afghanistan who risk, the starvation or the hunger or the extreme levels of poverty, where in villages, in rural areas, people are dropping their baby daughters and sons in the mosque and saying, look, I can't feed them anymore, right? I think it is our fault now as Afghans. Yes, this is a country, as I said earlier on, where we come from a very painful past, not too distant, but that is the only way. The path to reconciliation is there. What brings us together, in my view, as an Afghan, is our shared suffering. There are a lot of things that can divide us. There are a lot of things that can, mean opposing ideas. And I do worry, actually, that this poisonous environment is often promoted by those who are the most educated. Obviously, they are never the majority, but it takes one or two people to start that campaign. And that you can see that on any single day in a Twitter space. You go to it and it actually makes me even more depressed, which is why I fail to go to those. And if you follow the Taliban's strategy, whether it's the poetry contest or it's Facebook, and thanks God, the Taliban are using even TikTok, right? So they have adopted very well to the technology. That idea of Afghans reacting in a wave of emotions is not helpful. And then you have non-Afghans, you have some of our Western friends and colleagues who are actually making decisions on our behalf behind closed doors. And we're saying, hey, stop doing that, because I don't know what you've promised, what can be honored or not honored. And this whole idea that Afghanistan is continuously discussed behind closed doors where there's no transparency, I think this is the greatest betrayal that anyone can do to the people of Afghanistan. But again, time for Afghans to take responsibility, and also time for former officials to basically, realize that what they have brought on the country, the monumental miscalculation that they have inflicted on us. So instead of remorse, instead of basically quietly going away, everyone is trying to reinvent itself. And that is, I think, what is adding to the greatest layers and layers of complexities and confusions, because it is a war of narratives. Everyone is trying to basically put their own narrative.
I want to be mindful of the time. It's 1:43. So I just want to, as a closing question to you all, ask you a little bit about, the kinds of alternative futures that might be possible. Maria, I'm wondering in your case, what sorts of liberation did some of the women's movements dream of that might today provide a resource and that might sit uncomfortably with the current moment and a kind of statist imaginary, and with others as well. I'm wondering what other sites we can imagine, sort of and alternative avenues for Afghanistan that go beyond the current predicament, that go beyond perhaps even statist imaginaries, and kind of dream a different trans-regional relationship. So Maria, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess sort of building on some of what Bilal was saying, what I hope for, and I'm actually Palestinian American, so I'm part of this really strong diaspora and very politically engaged and kind of have seen the sort of power in that movement throughout my whole life and experienced it. And so I talk to my Afghan friends now who've come to the US or who are stuck in other places. And we talk about where the Afghan diaspora and where Afghans in Afghanistan are, where the movement is of people like Bilal is talking about, who are thinking together and thinking about the kind of future they want, that pushes for transparency, for not having all of the decisions about Afghanistan made without engaging the majority of Afghans and behind closed doors. And so, I mean, all I can think is like, I wish and hope and see this emerging, a stronger sort of movement and connection between people who have a stake in Afghanistan's future because they're from Afghanistan or they have family there or what have you, and who are pushing back against these, neo-colonial practices, these forms of violence, as Palestinian organizers do. And I think, I always think I literally had this conversation with an Afghan friend of mine over and over again. And we talk a lot about how Palestinians have been doing this for decades. They've been really had a lot of like financial resources and sort of resources and organizing in diaspora and organizing with people in the resistance. And I just think like we have to think about building those kinds of movements. And that's what I hope for beyond a women's movement, and women are very well positioned to do that work because they've been organizing in incredibly adverse situations in Afghanistan for decades and doing a lot of organizing across different regions and rural urban so-called divides. So this is a bit idealistic, but I also see a real political strategy in just building stronger, solidarity across the diaspora and with Afghans in Afghanistan still. And I'll
so much. Thank you so much, Maria. Unfortunately, we have to be mindful of the time and close, but I think ending on this link with Palestine also ties this talk with a lot of other talks we had and with a lot of other discussions we have about effective political mobilization in the age of the late war on terror, I'd say. So thank you all for joining us. We're really, really, really grateful that the whole series wouldn't have been the same, and we knew that, and that's why we wanted to invite you. Wouldn't have been the same without you all. And we'd like to thank all of you for coming. We'd also like to thank our assistants who are making this possible, Karim Malak and Elmira Ahmad. And we'd like also to thank the faculty members who've been helping us through organizing these things, including Manan Ahmed, Marwa Shakri, and Brinkley Messick. Technologies of Power was made possible with the support of the Dean of Humanities at Columbia University, as well as the Center for the Study of Muslim Societies, the Department of History and Anthropology, and the Middle East Institute. And of course, Madiha and I's institution, which are Arizona State University and the University of Toronto. Thank you for joining us and have a great end of the weekend all.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.